So recently there's been a lot of talk about which group of men is more misogynistic, chads, incels, and probably some other people. Alexander Datesyke, aka the Chadistician, put out a video, and a number of people on Twitter have either retweeted things, and it is an interesting question. But I'm not really here to debate the statistics. You can go check out the video by the Chadistician or look up any of the studies that have been posted on Twitter, because I'm more interested in the semantics, frankly speaking, of what's going on here. When people talk about misogyny, one imagines they're talking about hostile sexism. These days, the term misogyny is so overused and blatantly used that I struggle with the legitimate definition of the word such that it actually maps onto reality. Because I can imagine the misogyny actually meaning something like pure hatred of women, hating them with that intense feeling, which some men and some women actually feel is a legit thing. But oftentimes when people talk about misogyny, they're talking about things that are quite nebulous, difficult to pin down, and difficult to define. But what I really want to challenge here is this notion that being interested in having sex with women somehow implies gynophilia, the opposite of misogyny. That if you like having sex with women, you enjoy having intercourse with women, that makes you actually like women. And for the record, there is some information that suggests that the chadliest of chads are typically, quote-unquote, more misogynistic, and we can talk about that in a bit. But let's just deal with this one idea of if you enjoy having sex with women, then you, quote-unquote, like women. And I can tell you a story. You probably know a little bit about this story. It was my first long-term relationship of over 2 years. You know, the one with the gigantic zonkas, who sucked the meanest pee-pee I had ever encountered. I had never had blowjobs before or since like that in my entire life, and I was in my late teens and early 20s, and the same applies to the sex. And so I was quite literally hooked on this girl for the sake of intercourse and her gazonkas. Now, on top of that, she cooked really well, but in terms of getting along, in terms of me appreciating her personality, she was pretty unstable. She lost her temper very easily. She was controlling, tried to run me over with a car on top of all of that. And so for a long time, I stuck with this relationship because, well, again, gazonkas, blowjobs, and sex, and decent cooking. And I can confidently say, retrospectively, almost 30 years later, that I was not together with this girl because I had any interest in her as a person. Quite the opposite. She was, again, really, really good in bed, and she cooked a mean meal. But as a person and her personality and how she treated me in a general sense outside of the sexual context, retrospectively, I didn't think much of her. And I think this applies in broad strokes to a lot of men who don't appear, quote-unquote, overtly misogynistic, but the things they value about women are not the typical traits or characteristics that most people associate with women. Rather, they're interested, to be very blunt, in the holes that the women provide, or sometimes in their gazonkas as well. But it's all part of the same package. They're interested in the physical, carnal relationship that they can extract from a woman. Whether the other stuff interests them is a different question and debatable. And depending on the interpretation of the data, one set suggests that the chadliest of men are, quote-unquote, more misogynistic. Now, why would they be that? Well, probably because they realize that these women that they sleep with are means to an end. They don't actually enjoy the company of the women. They don't appreciate their personality traits. But what they really want is to get laid and to enjoy carnal pleasure with them. And many of these chads, I suspect, don't even like the personality traits of the average woman. And to be fair, what man really does? Cattiness, pickiness, moodiness, to name but a few, these are not things that most men enjoy about your average woman. They're things that most men tolerate in your average woman, provided the sex seems worth it. And you can add a number of things to that. Women that drag along their partners or husbands to go clothes shopping. Women who force men to watch chick flicks. What I'm saying here is that there's a suite of traits that you could associate rather readily with women, personality traits, character traits, general behavioral patterns that most men don't really like and at best tolerate about women all the while being very interested in having sex with women. And the irony here is, by the lights of normal feminist claims, a man who primarily values women for the sex that she can provide to him, which is the case most of the time, is not really valuing that woman and is therefore, quote-unquote, misogynistic, which I think maps onto at least one set of data that suggests that the Chadliest of Chads are typically more, quote-unquote, misogynistic than, say, incels or guys who get much less play. And the point I'm trying to drive home here is pretty simple. Ultimately, what is misogyny? Well, you could argue that in a legitimate sense, if you really feel seething hatred towards women, then I suppose you could call that misogyny. You're consumed by it, you express it. But on the other hand, most men, if they can, prefer to spend time with other men doing things they enjoy, exchanging common interests and hobbies and what have you, and they would prefer to spend that time, when it's not related to sex, with other men. Does that then make them misogynistic? Well, some people might argue that, and personally, if I have a choice, I would vastly prefer to spend time with men, whether it's talking with them, hiking with them, doing sports with them, whatever it might be. That would be my preference. And this is because I generally, on average, do not love the typical traits that women have on display. I do not have a seething hatred for women. I don't think about it all day. In fact, I barely think about women as a rule unless it comes up in a certain context. But given a choice outside of a sexual context, I will prefer to spend my time with men. And this is an important point to make, again, because so much of the time this word misogyny is bandied about. It's more of a buzzword than anything else. It's really hard to pin down. And I think if you're going to conduct studies revolving around misogyny coming from men, you should have a very precise idea and notion of what is meant by quote-unquote misogyny. And in the context of the culture war, a lot of the claims of misogyny are not only false claims, but they're simply indications that men have different tastes and preferences to women. Or the term is used as an ad hominem against men because they might not agree with something women have said or written, and so it goes. Again, I submit to you, by the lights of many common definitions, many men, maybe even most men, are quote-unquote misogynistic because, apart from the sexual context, most straight men vastly prefer to spend time with other men doing things, be it sport, be it hobbies, be it just talking, whatever it is. They prefer that because men are more similar to other men, they get along better with other men, and they often have very little in common with women. Add to that the vastly different personality traits, at least on average, and you end up in the situation where, yeah, most men don't quote-unquote like women in a conventional sense. And by that I mean they of course like having sex with them, but you're all familiar both with the feeling and the notion of post-cum clarity, that after ejaculation you very oftentimes want to have very little to do with the female in question. And again, this points to this notion that men and women don't really get along amazingly well. They need each other for the sake of reproduction, but all things being in balance, women prefer to spend time with other women, and men prefer to spend time with other men, setting aside the interest in sex. But only wanting to have sex with women does not mean you're gynophilic or you enjoy spending time with women, which would then be attributable to enjoying their company and their personality traits, etc., etc. I hope I've driven this point home, because in all this talk of misogyny, it is important to understand what we mean by misogyny, which I would define as real, legitimate, seething hatred, as opposed to what a lot of people will claim it is and what you find in the mainstream. As always, thank you for tuning in. Many special thanks to my patrons and my donors on PayPal. You guys are the best. You keep the channel alive. And if you engage in the usual YouTube jazz of liking the video, sharing the video, leaving a comment, subbing, if you're not yet a sub, be much appreciated. Until the next time, if I'm still alive, I'll check you out then. May the gods watch over you. Goodbye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.